What does the arcane and the chicken have in common? They both can lay. Ley lines are both a fantasy staple and rare in their use. Ask most fans of fantasy about ley lines and they'll give you the gist that there are these super highways of magical energy that crisscross the globe. But they're like the background set piece of an 80s movie. They're introduced but static, oftentimes painted in and are a given, but you're supposed to look at it from afar and focus on the foreground with Matthew Broderick and Michelle Pfeiffer. But what if ley lines were more than just a decoration? These are arcane currents that encircle the globe, and there are more things that we can do with them than just hang a sign on them that says, "This is a fantasy world." Today we're going to discuss the Earthrealm origins for ley lines, from their humble, boring origins to what they're built up to be. We'll discuss their functions in fantasy worlds and what little exists in D&D, and then we'll discuss my philosophy for them. Because I'll be adding them to my next campaign world that I'm currently working on, and I have ideas for how I want to use them as a DM, but also opinions on how they shouldn't be used, because players should still have fun. So without any further ado, this one's for you, Callie. On Earth, outside of the fiction of D&D, ley lines as a named concept have only existed for about 100 years. In 1922, a British antiquarian called Alfred Watkins found that he could draw straight lines between significant structures and ruins of the past, and that many of these sites could be linked by a single straight line between all of them. He put forward the possibility that these lines were once used as trade routes for early societies, and that the sites were the markers by which people could correctly follow the routes without deviating. He called these lines leys, from the Old English word meaning cleared space, and because a few settlements running along those lines ended in ley. Archaeology was a new science at the time, but those few archaeologists and historians disagreed with him, rather profoundly. They pointed out that these lines intersected sites that were centuries apart in terms of creation, like a village from the 1500s and a stone monolith from the 800s. And they also pointed out that straight lines aren't actually the fastest route to other places, when you have to take into account features such as mountains, rivers, and other environmental hazards. But Watkins found a few followers to continue on in his theory, and who decided to walk in straight lines across the country in order to discover ley lines by the sites they'd see along the way. Watkins published a book in 1927 called Ley Line Hunters, but the science never really caught on. That might have been the end of it, save for humanity's penchant for continually finding a bigger meaning in things. In the 1960s, people started to believe that instead of the lines being the cause of trade routes, perhaps they were the lines of energy that encircled the globe, and that these sites and ruins lined up because humans were drawn subconsciously to these alignments. Tony Wedd in 1961 even put forward the belief that ley lines were in fact magnetic currents that guided alien spacecraft. And a magazine called Ley Hunters helped evolve a quasi-magical belief into a greater idea, that the ley lines could be used in conjunction with magical practices such as dowsing or numerology, eventually with the goal to usher in a new age of supernatural transformation. Let's switch to the fantasy of the Forgotten Realms, and I know that Elminster walks the earth and visits Ed Greenwood on occasion, but for the sake of ease, let's still just call it fantasy. Mystra, goddess of magic, was the embodiment of the weave and of magic herself. It's said that her veins are the ley lines, her breath the mist, and her body the pulsing, thrumming earth. Ley lines were the above-ground shifting rivers and currents of magic, self-regulating and replenishing, energy centers that could help to heal damaged parts of the weave and fill up parts of the weave that had been temporarily drained of magic. Veins carrying lifeblood and platelets, providing energy to a living system. And just like other aspects of magic, it could also be manipulated. The Geomancer was a 3rd edition prestige class that was available to anyone who could cast both arcane and divine spells. Fun point, it was the very first prestige class I ever tried. I loved it. The description for the Geomancer stated as thus. In the area he calls home, and sorry, 3rd edition was very much he for a lot of things. Anyway, in the area he calls home, be it high on a mountain, deep in the forest, or even beneath an ocean, he weaves ley lines, powerful connections to the land itself. The spells he casts through these connections with the earth are reflections of his own strength of will. As the geomancer progresses, however, the effort of gathering magic through the earth takes a physical toll on him, making him more and more like the land and its creatures. Ley lines were raw magic, the weave being an extension of Mystra's will rather than her blood. The geomancer being able to cast both arcane and divine spells as a singular source by weaving their own ley lines teaches us two things. Ley lines are supposed to be mutable, and they affect spells and casters universally. This secret means that also wizards can't cast Cure Wounds and clerics can't cast Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion because of the agreement between Mystra and the rest of the gods, instead of the spells being fundamentally different. They both come from the same source. But then that's not really much of an insight. There are enough spells that are on arcane and divine spell lists to really drive the point home that some spells are available, some spells are not, and it's not because of the limitations of the magic itself. So let's go back to the first two. Ley lines are mutable, all spells are the same to the source. Ley lines were manipulated by a spell called Node Genesis, N-O-D-E, Genesis, a level 9 Saw Wiz spell from the Forgotten Realms book, Champions of Ruin, that took 80 hours to cast, spread over 10 days. The spell's description was, when you cast the spell, the arcane energies reroute local ley lines and telluric currents, creating a Class 1 node. Casting the spell also made the node's password protected by you, and then the node would slowly grow over time, but otherwise was like any other node. The spell rerouted ley lines so that they crisscrossed. The spell description doesn't say that you use the energies to create something from nothing, rather that the crossing of ley lines itself naturally forms a node. So what's a node? The same book explains thus. Magic and energy of the planes flow freely throughout the world of Toril. Archmages wield unthinkable powers, and priests of dark gods perform rituals to concentrate evil in their unholy shrines. The direct efforts of such power being directed by mortals are obvious to all, but there are more subtle consequences as well. In the labyrinth of darkness and stone beneath the surface of the world, such energies pull to create earth nodes, where powerful magic is trapped in the stone itself. Node magic taps the natural pools and streams of power that collect and run below the earth. The power is not visible to the unpracticed eye, but those with the appropriate sensitivity know that collection points called earth nodes are awash with power that can increase the effects of spells and produce other magical effects. Earth nodes are rare and cherished points in the Underdark, and their discoverers jealously guard the knowledge of them. However, many Earth nodes that possess no natural outlet to the greater tunnel systems of the Underdark remain undiscovered, and others are simply unappreciated by the Underdark creatures that live in or near them. My interpretation from this is that ley lines can be shifted by mortal magic, made to run to a nexus or move from one place to another. These lines are needed for the preservation of the magic of the world, and being moved from one place to another could decrease magical energy in an area and heighten it in another. Where they crossed, the overbleed could rain down upon the earth itself, and magical energy could be stored in stone and crystal. Mortals could sense them and affect them, sometimes unknowingly, and permanent change could be done, though it required powerful concentration. Coming up after the break, we'll discuss how I want to use ley lines to provide a small boost to players in the right situations, and also introduce ways that these could be used to create stories in our world. But first, a word from our sponsor. Have you experienced unexplained phenomena in your house or workplace? Have any of your possessions appeared in illogical places? Or are they always not where you're certain you put them down? Is there anything on your person that you picked up one day, and just can't find a good reason to drop? We stand at the dawning of a new age, with a level of magic far beyond anything in the past 1,000 years. And we here at Red Faction are here to protect you from the magic items that have slept for so long, and now are beginning to reawaken. Contact us now, we are available 24/7. We will send specialist teams to detect, bag, and tag the items that even now could be lying in wait to strike at your loved ones. No charge for a false alarm, so why delay? Contact us now for the security of knowing your children are safe in their own home. Red Faction. The eyes of the people, guiding the work of the gods. In my next campaign world, Kyklos Sidirou, the Cycle of Iron, the world is slowly recovering from a severe depletion of magic. So severe that a level 20 Archmage or High Priest were the only people who could cast the rare and spectacular second level spell. Whole areas of the world were dead magic and the fringes were wild magic, as magic fluctuated wildly, and casting a spell meant that sometimes only half the cast could go through, leading to the weaving of very strange haphazard effects. But with the firing of the reality cannon, the current campaign world's near-full collection of multiplanar magic was fired at the Far Realm in a single moment to prevent a planar conjunction. It got complicated. Yeah. The excess energy sped through space and hit the Iron Cycle and jump-started magic once more. And what were once trickles, ley lines are the telluric torrents of magic that you could see on more established worlds such as Faerun. As a DM, I want to add ley lines as a source of magical power for both my players and for the NPCs, but I have a philosophy for adding power such as ley lines that I need to follow. Class levels and features are important to a character and their player. The classes are given their abilities, and it's not unsurprising that they give a sense of identity to a hero. Anyone can roll a d20 and say a thing hits the monster for 1d8 damage, but it takes a fighter to be able to do that 3 times in a turn. It takes a ranger to send their pet in to do that 1d8 damage, and it takes a spellcaster to make that 1d8 a specific energy type with an added flashy effect. Spells are a tool for identity for players to lean into, especially handy for new players who can tailor their spells more to the character's temperament, rather than what spells would be best for the environment they're facing. Though, having precisely the correct spells for what they're facing is itself definitive of a type of identity. The point is, DMs don't take away a player's identity for no reason. Ley lines have the ability to empower a player, but there's the counter idea that if the presence of an unseen force can give you so many better spells, then the absence of it should take away spells completely. And it would be so easy to say one day that it just doesn't work. The characters have walked into a place where there is no ley lines, no warning at all, because the DM knows what they are and where they are, and the players don't yet. Spells just don't work. But break that down, think about the consequences. Because now you've created a framework around the world that boils down to, if I go to these specific locations, then I can't cast Fireball. And I really like casting Fireball. And eventually, you might find that the player will either avoid the area altogether, or else find a way to subvert it. Subverting it sounds fun. Yeah, totally, it's a way to forward the plot you might be wanting them to follow, and who doesn't want a player interested in the world mechanics? But for my players at least, subversion doesn't lead to a way to experiment with the world. You may find that once the players have found a way around the problem, they just ignore the problem. The ley lines become once again the painted background of an 80s Ladyhawke movie. Nor do we want them to become too powerful. Subversion becomes inversion. The power of the spellcaster becomes OP compared to martial classes, and it's harder to balance the fights around a caster that has figured out how to drag the ley lines along with them, so that every magic missile or spell they cast is empowered and quickened, or whatever you decide to do with it. So for the players, my philosophy has led to this. In places where there is no ley line activity, the base power is the least power. Game on is normal, no one should have to lose anything that the DM creates as an addition to the base rules, unless it's a rule change or lore point that is both broadcasted loudly in the environment and is agreed to by everyone playing. No one wants to be nerfed, and it won't help the cause if there's an underlying logic to the nerf that only you know about. It will still seem random and unfair to the affected players. In places where there is nominal ley line activity, magic energy will extend to and empower a class feature, not the spells. Clerics could gain an extra channel divinity during a fight, sorcerers could gain 2 extra spell points, wizards will be able to arcanely recover an extra spell. These are things that give choice to a player but are not themselves OP. They provide a bit more freedom but don't make the fight trivial. And for the player, they may not decide to use them, but they would hopefully feel okay because the option is there. For the purely martial classes, we've seen that leyline energy can interact with stone and gems. Why not metals as well? Weapons will hit as though they are magical with a +1 bonus to damage. In this way, we don't overpower the casters by affecting their spells, and we still give something to the martial players that the casters can also use if they wish. Empowering a damaging spell so that it deals damage in half is also a bit of a limiter, because it means that the caster may feel compelled to take a more evocative approach to spells, rather than encouraging utility also. In places where there's a nexus of leyline activity, each spell caster gains a spell slot 1 level higher than their highest spell slot normally available. So where the ley lines crisscross, there's an abundance of magical energy. That should represent, in some way, bigger than just normal leyline activity. It doesn't mean that they learn a new spell, but suddenly they have an option to heighten a spell, which gives a bit more options in their fight. For the martial classes, weapons and armor will have +1 to attack and damage and +1 armor class respectively. Other casters have that as well, but it's not so much of a big draw for them, apart from the armor class of course. Finally, an abundance of magic may allow very rare or legendary magical items to activate, which may lead to plots, such as the leyline nexus depowered after extended use of a plot item, and characters needing to find new ways to detect and travel to them in order to advance the story. For me, in Kyklos Sidirou, no leyline activity will be the norm, and nominal leyline activity will be heralded by signs in the environment. They may also shift over time. In my world, nexus points will harken back to Earth, and you'll know of a place that is either a nexus or was, due to the ancient and powerful ruins or sites of power that stand there now. Expect climactic battles to be fought there with powerful energies that balance the boost in power. Expect evil wizards who have spent their lives developing ley abilities, such as the ability to summon from other planes of existence, because magic itself is breathing through to other planes. Imagine fantastical dragons whose breath weapons are empowered by the earth nodes beneath their feet, or massive golems, which are only able to function in levels of high magic, and any other place drop dead or dormant. Expect anything, as long as the DM doesn't expect you to take a dip in fun. Thank you for your time and for listening about ley lines. In the comments below, tell me, how do you, or how would you, use ley lines in your campaign world? Until that time, have a good day everyone, and to be continued.